Just giving you another fun-sized review for this year's Jack-O-Ween. This time, the Hulu exclusive remake of Hellraiser.
What is it you pray for?
Riley, a young girl struggling with addiction, steals a puzzle box from a rich man. The puzzle, when solved, requires a blood sacrifice, which also summons creatures known as Cenobites from a realm where pain and pleasure are one and the same. Hellraiser, as opposed to every other iconic horror franchise, has gotten nothing but the short end of the stick. The first movie is considered an all-time classic, and the second movie is very much in that same vein, almost being a second part of the first movie. Third film is okay, but all of the later movies are just unwatchable to bland. And for something based around the mind of Clive Barker, who is one of the most creative writers in not just horror, but in general, to use filmistic descriptions similar to H.P. Lovecraft, but in many regards better than Lovecraft because the description is so vague and yet so detailed at the same time. But the question is, how does this movie stand on its own as compared to the other movies in the Hellraiser franchise and on its own? Well, to be honest, pretty damn well. Honestly, this is one of the best remakes of a horror movie I've seen in quite a long time. It did follow my basic chemistry plan of when you do a remake, you just have to pay tribute to the source material, follow the original steps at least as far as the base amount, do something different, and make it stand on its own. This movie hits every single one of those notes, even following closer to the source material than the original even did. Normally, a lot of people would have issues with a gender-swapped version of an iconic character like Pinhead, but if you read the original source material, the Hell Priest is actually described as being more feminine than masculine, but they forced it to become male when it became a movie because everyone was an iconic male slasher. So I did enjoy that aspect of changing it because I believe Hellraiser is one of those franchises that can adapt over time with the torture methods, with the blood, the gore, the effects. And this movie has such a great amount that is put into this, and I'm so happy that it was as good as it is. The main character, played by Odessa Azion, is pretty damn good. She's not great, she doesn't have a huge amount of personality aside from being a drug addict, but her subtle little moments where she has this lament in her eyes, this sadness, this overwhelming grief, and yet this contemplative thought, the way she looks, is really focusing on the story in a way that really I haven't seen since the very first character of the original Hellraiser movie. So how are the effects? Well, the effects are varying from very good detailed to being very subtly implied. It knows just the right amount to pull away from and just the right amount to show. Because the problem with a lot of the Hellraiser franchise is it tried doing too much without enough of a budget to pull it off. This had the budget to pull it off, did it just in the right amount of context to get you squirming in your seat. But the real question everyone wants to know is, how does Jamie Clayton's Hell Priest compare to Doug Bradley's Pinhead? They're similar, but they're also vastly different. If you watch the original Hellraiser, Pinhead is only in the movie for about 6 minutes, maybe. And people forget that part because he's just such an iconic figurehead in the movie. He's even on the cover of the movies. But just like in the original story, the Hell Priest is just shown as a way to keep the tension rising, to remind the audience that the Cenobites are always watching, that they're always there, ever present, and constantly manipulating what's going on. And Jamie Clayton has a good presence about her. When she performs, it's just enough. The voice isn't too forced, the voice isn't too deep, it isn't too dark, it isn't too feminine and not feminine at the same time. The effects are really well done. One of the things that makes this movie stand out as opposed to the other Hellraisers, though, is the original Hellraisers in the franchise has a leather built onto their skin to make it into a suit, whereas this one, it's just their skin that's turned into a kind of makeshift suit, which is closer to how the original book was described. It's done in a way that I'm like, okay, there's some goodness in this. There's also a few little nods to the original, And there's also a good explanation for both old school fans that followed the lore very deeply, like myself, and the new casual fans that need a bit more explaining of things than the original could provide when they first made it. So overall, if you're into the horror franchise Hellraiser, you will really enjoy this. As long as you go in with an open mind and don't try to compare too much to the original, you'll really love it. But I will say, if you're not a fan of gore and you're not a fan of like very vigorous, kind of squirming, torturous style of horror, then I would probably step away from this. I'd also recommend not getting too much into the horror scene in general, but since you're listening to this and on my channel, you must be at least somewhat of a fan of horror. Hope you all keep enjoying Jack-O-Ween.